Today, I'm delighted to have Lisa Jordan, the Deputy Director of the Global Civil Society Unit at the Ford Foundation, here today. Lisa has worked there for about 5 years, I believe, and prior to that has served in a number of capacities working with NGOs and other organizations, has worked on Capitol Hill. She directed the Bank Information Center, a nonprofit that looked at the activities of the World Bank. So she has a wide variety of experience, but in her role at the Ford Foundation, she has this sort of landscape view of the entire scene of what's happening with NGOs and broader global civil society. So today she's going to give us that donor's perspective. And so without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Lisa, but I'm delighted that you could join us today, and thanks so much.
Thank you. Well, I'm really honored by the turnout and excited to be in Texas. I've only been here once before, and I've been hearing a lot of really great things about the LBJ school, so it's fun to be down here. Contrary to the flyer that's standing on the walls around the hallway, I'm not really going to talk about my book on NGO accountability, which Josh is now going to hold up so that you'll all buy it, because we had a discussion about whether I should address that topic, which is a huge topic and a very hot topic today, or if I should talk about global civil society, which is the larger context within which the book is crafted. And we thought perhaps the larger context would be of interest to folks who are here. So I'm going to talk about global civil society. I'm going to say what definition we use at the Ford Foundation, why it's important to us, whether it's an effective agent for enhancing democracy, how could it be more effective, and lastly, a little bit about the context within which we're operating today. I will talk a little bit about new and old philanthropy, which some people might be interested in, and I'm going to talk about the new emerging security paradigm in which a lot of the global civic actions are taking place. So I'm going to throw a lot at you. I understand that some of you may have a class at 1 o'clock. If I'm going too fast or you can't hear me, just put your hand up and wave at me and I'll slow down. And I would appreciate it if you could hold questions until we get through the entire talk, because some people might have to leave. So jot all your questions down. So what is global civil society? Global civil society is a new layer of networks and organizations that operate at the transnational level. Its density is new, i.e. there are now well over 20,000 of these networks, 90% of which have been formed within the last 30 years. Some of you may have heard of things like Jubilee 2000, the Landmines Campaign, or the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, global movements for human rights, women's rights, and environmental justice. A lot of these global movements have become household names at this point. At the Foundation, we've combined structural, normative, and public sphere conceptions of civil society to create a working definition of global civil society. So for our purposes, global civil society refers to all coalitions, networks, movements, and organizations that organize themselves across national borders to effect progressive social change in the global political arena. So that's the definition that the Ford Foundation uses. For those of you who are studying global civil society, you'll know that this is a contested concept, that there are all of these competing definitions for it. So we did have to craft something that would allow for us to be able to move forward and to look at progressive social change. So interesting debate is had about what is or isn't within global civil society, and let's take the most topical issue, Al-Qaeda. Is this part of global civil society or not? You know, there's a professor up at Syracuse who says that it's an NGO and it's part of global civil society, and thus NGOs should really not be tolerated. He does. This is his argument. Okay, so is Al-Qaeda part of global civil society? It is, from my perspective. It's not an NGO like World Vision or CARE. It's a social movement. It has the construction of a social movement. The Ford Foundation's definition of civil society is laden with normative goals that would preclude support for something like Al-Qaeda or other fundamentalist movements, and would also preclude support for things like organizations that traffic human beings or drug traders or so on and so forth. But people need to understand that the networks and the shape of these types of organizations and movements, and the fact that they are not part of governments and they're not part of the corporate, not part of state structures, not part of corporate structures, does, under some definitions, place them squarely within a civil society framework. So, another contested discussion is whether international NGOs constitute global civil society. Some of the campaigns that I just mentioned, like the International Campaign to Ban Landmines and the Jubilee 2000 campaign, did not include, for the most part, Oxfam, CARE, World Vision, Save the Children, the private voluntary organizations that come out of the UK and the US. So clearly, those types of organizations, INGOs, they're often called, do not constitute the whole of global civil society, or perhaps even the majority of global civil society. They are a part of, but they do not represent the whole of global civil society. And in fact, the Ford Foundation does not tend to support the international NGOs that raise money from the public. What roles do global civil society play? This is the next topic that I want to address. The emergence of global civil society can be interpreted as a response by citizens to globalization, rapidly changing conditions of governance and community. That's how we define globalization. Globalization has shortened geographic distance through new communications technologies that make global networking easier and faster. It's concentrated media ownership, yet it's expanded the types of mediums that are available. It's spread networks of terrorists, but also of citizens. It's disrupted traditional social structures while creating new communities of loyalty and practice. It's accelerated the exploitation of natural resources, but also fostered the capacity to monitor what's happening. And it's fostered economic growth outside of Africa, but it's increased inequality within and between nations. So global civil society, in some way, has emerged as one response to these changing conditions of social contracts, changing conditions of governance, and changing conditions of society. Globalization has resulted in over 300 institutions of global governance, all of which set global public policy, none of which operate through any form of democratic practice. And within this context, global civil society plays two very important roles. The first is to improve global governance. One of the central challenges that faces us today is to create new institutions and processes of governance at the global level that are transparent, that are accountable to citizens, and open to the voices of those who are affected by the decisions that are taken there. And while civil society cannot and should not replace governments in these negotiations, there are three ways in which global civil society can improve upon the process of global governance. One is by legitimizing the outcomes of decisions that are now taken by governments and intergovernmental bodies. For example, I often use climate change because it's one of the examples that I'm very familiar with. Global civil society can promote citizen action on climate change on the ground, i.e. here in Texas, there in South Africa, there in Cambodia, and it can legitimize the Kyoto Protocol in a way that governments who can confer authority but not legitimacy on decisions that are taken in the global arena, like the Kyoto Protocol decision. Global civil society can promote transparency and accountability in global institutions. For example, global civil society created something called the World Bank Inspection Panel. Of all the stakeholders in global governance, civil society has the largest stake in extending democracy and democratic principles to the global political arena. How many people are familiar with the inspection panel at the World Bank and what it does? Does anybody know about that? One. Okay, two. What it does is it allows people who live in developing countries whose lives or livelihoods have been impacted in a negative way by a development loan that's been granted by the World Bank. They have recourse to question whether or not the bank has violated any of its policies in producing or extending that loan. So it's a process of being able to question the decisions that have been taken at the World Bank that may have inadvertently impacted somebody negatively. And it was put into place because many, many indigenous communities around the world, Adivasis in particular in India, found that they were displaced predominantly by large infrastructure projects that have been funded by the World Bank. So the World Bank, whose mandate, of course, is to alleviate poverty around the world, had to figure out a way in which to respond to the fact that it actually created more poverty than it had alleviated through its loan structure. So, but that inspection panel would not exist if it weren't for citizen action across national borders. A third way in which global civil society can improve global governance is by providing a more competitive pool of policy ideas and information, thereby improving the quality of debates and decision making. Again, from the climate change experience, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is actually an independent body of 1,900 scientists, and it's vastly increased the quality and pool of policy options that are available to the negotiators that are trying to work on a protocol. The second role for global civil society, remember I mentioned that there were two potential roles. The second one is to identify needs and problems that tend to be ignored by states and markets, and to give voice to issues that require global public policy. Civil society has historically defined the need for global public policies, and then they've persuaded governments and businesses to address those needs. For example, debt relief, which came out of civil society, campaign to ban landmines, which came out of civil society, and I think the most deeply embedded is the protection of human rights. Most recently, civil society has demanded a global public policy for access to life-saving medicines for people with HIV/AIDS. And this is in place of restrictive policies that were crafted by the state and market forces that prioritized intellectual property rights of pharmaceutical companies over the needs of people with AIDS. Civil society not only defined the need for global public policy in these areas, but it's also expanded the range of policy options, again, that are available to resolve some of these problems. So, is global civil society an effective agent for enhancing democracy within global institutions? Global civil society is not democratic. It is not democratic itself in any way, and it has very serious limitations which impact its effectiveness as an agent for democracy. It's plagued by two main problems that weaken its potential to play the roles that I just outlined. It's plagued by elitism, that's the first problem, and a failure to address power and process within its own structures. That's the second problem. If you want to hear more about the second problem, look at the book. If you want to hear more, I'll talk a little bit more about the first problem. But the first problem, one of the big issues around the first problem is that the people who are engaged in global civic processes look more like me, and the people who are impacted by them live and sit in developing countries. 70% of the people who are impacted by World Bank, IMF, World Trade Organization, the standard-setting organizations, the Bank for International Settlements, you can go on and name all of the different global governing bodies. They tend to have more power and authority over folks in developing countries than they do here. Yet the response is often well-resourced out of the United States, out of Europe, and so you get a lot of very strong global civic institutions coming out of the Western states. So that's one of the big problems that the Ford Foundation is trying to address within global civil society. I'm not going to really talk about how these problems manifest themselves, but I'm going to skip to the interesting question of whether or not the limitations that global civil society has impeded its ability to be able to demand democracy. And to a point, global civil society has been an effective agent for democratic change in spite of the fact that it's an elite society and that it's not very accountable. When global civil society turns its attention to governance, three fundamental democratic principles inform civic action and demands in the global political arena. These are transparency, participation, and accountability. So these are the three issues that you often see these global social movements or global NGOs focusing on. These are process issues. Transparency is widely demanded, and battle by battle, global public policy formation is gradually undertaken in a more transparent manner. One of the great, I'll talk about an example of this. It's a great civic alliance that's underway now, and it's done a lot to advance the cause of transparency. It's called the Global Transparency Initiative, and it's an alliance that marries people and activists who focus on the international financial institutions at the global level with watchdogs and folks from human rights organizations, especially freedom of expression and freedom of information activists at the national level. So you have a set of global activists and a set of national activists working together to create social change in both political arenas. Together, these activists have mapped what is made publicly available by governments and by the international financial institutions into a database that has about 2,500 indicators of publicly available information. And they've married them all together, and they've essentially defined a gold standard for transparency of information disclosure. And they started to test which arenas offer more information through freedom of information requests. So they would put freedom of information requests through at the national level using national FOIA policies. And they would also use the international venues available at different political institutions like the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank or the African Development Bank to see whether or not those information policies got them different sets of information. And so by marrying these two types of freedom of information requests, they were able to challenge conditionalities that are set by governments, often around security issues, and set by international financial institutions, often around private sector disclosure, confidential business confidentiality agreements, and challenge those two arguments for not producing things or putting documents and information into the public domain. They got a big breakthrough in 2005 when the Asian Development Bank agreed to a policy that presumes public disclosure of all documents and makes secrecy a big exception. And that's a 190-degree turn around from previous policies that presume secrecy with disclosure as the exception. That would not have happened if you did not have two communities, national and global, working together, and if you did not combine two different types of activists. Human rights activists, FOIA activists, freedom of expression activists, with international financial institutions reform activists who are often primarily motivated either by social injustice or environmental injustice. So you had a number of different types of community coming together to create a breakthrough in a global institution. Another issue that global civil society tends to focus on is participation. And by participation, I mean access to a voice in decision-making, not access to implement development projects that are designed by aid agencies and multilateral institutions. So how decisions get set, not then implementing decisions made by other powerful decision makers. Social movements at the national level and international NGOs in the global public policy arena working together have, one, access to decision makers and a right to a voice, and sometimes even more. International NGOs, in conjunction with the national social movements, have forced global institutions to develop accountability mechanisms that hint at the right to redress when basic human rights have been violated. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights is one example. The World Bank Inspection Panel, which I just explained, is another. And the right to file amicus briefs at the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and at ICSID, which is a dispute settlement mechanism buried inside the World Bank, is yet another. All of these institutions give the public a way in to challenge decisions that have been taken at the institutions, which didn't exist, well, really, before 1992, you didn't have any of these kinds of mechanisms, but now they're coming online. The limitations of the mechanisms are probably greater than the rights that they bring, but nevertheless, these are breakthroughs and they should be noted as such. In some global governing institutions, civil society has more than a voice. They actually have a vote. At the ILO, unions have a vote. The International Labor Organization, unions have a vote. In the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Biological Diversity Alliance has a vote. They can actually sit down and craft policy alongside government agencies. And in the Global Fund for AIDS, Malaria, and Tuberculosis, at both national and global level, civil society has 2 seats on the governing body in the global political arena, and civil society has 2 seats in every national arena in which there's a national plan, because it's mandated through the global infrastructure that civil society has to have a seat at the table. Some people are really excited by this. They think this is a great thing because finally there's public representation in global governing institutions. My own feeling about it is that we are, as civil society, we are not really very well prepared to be at the table with a vote as opposed to a voice. And that is because we do not have mechanisms of accountability as civil society that hold us to account for the actions that are taken. So we can talk about that because my activist friends would scream at me if they heard me saying that. But in fact, I don't think that we have the democratic mechanisms to hold us to account to beneficiaries to be having a vote at the table. Not that every government and corporation does either, but that's the democracy deficit that is challenging us in the global political arena. In other nascent ways, global civil society has been very important in bringing democracy to the entire realm of global governance. As noted before, it can legitimize governance arrangements and decision. It's beginning to demand separation of powers. It won in the battle to have a court that protects people instead of states. This is the International Criminal Court. It has an independent judiciary now to address crimes against humanity, and accountability mechanisms are coming into play that are institutionally specific and protect people from the actions of their state agents. Many groups are beginning to ask for parliament or parliamentary input and participation in the UN, in the United Nations. So civil society in some ways has been an agent of democracy and perhaps even an effective one in spite of its limitations of being elite and not having accountability mechanisms that are helpful. Maybe the greatest indication of its power to force power to act in the sunshine is that it's now under attack, and nobody bothers to attack something that's ineffective. So we know it's had some power. However, it continually bumps up against its limitations, and state and corporate interests that have hard power, not soft power, are an issue to confront. How could it be more effective? I think there are 5 ways in which global civil society could be more effective. The first one is by creating better links between global and national activists. So the examples that I gave of very successful campaigns link national activists with global activists. I think that an isolated civic voice at a global institution is not very powerful. It's certainly not powerful enough to counter the back and forth between national capitals and state representatives who operate within the global political arena. Also, if you're only operating globally, you have no access to any media market. When you turn on the 6 o'clock news here in Austin, you do not get a story about what just happened in the Doha round. You don't. Half of you probably don't even know what the Doha round is. You know, I hope you do, but you know, it's not on TV. All media markets are local. So if you don't have a way into the national political conversation or even a local political conversation, you don't have exposure, and you're not going to really be able to mobilize public opinion in a great way. The campaign for the International Criminal Court, we were talking about this last night, that campaign was very successful because you had a series of activists that challenged through the UN structure the conversation that was happening there, linked very forcefully and closely with activists, human rights activists working at the national level. And they would never have gotten the International Criminal Court resolution passed without that kind of linkage between national and global, which allowed people who were sitting in the negotiations or listening to the negotiations or crawling around in the corridors of the negotiations literally to get on the telephone and call somebody back in Washington and say, the U.S. representative just said X. Do something about that. And that person would call Jim Leach, Senator Leach, and Senator Leach would call the State Department and say, your guy just said X. And, you know, the ball game was blown because the U.S. government had assumed that there would not be that kind of connectivity, but that kind of connectivity kept states straight. So I think that's a really important aspect of global civil society, and it can be much more effective if you have more of those kinds of alliances. A second way to create agencies that are agents of people would be to develop independent money streams for global governing institutions. There's one of these independent money streams that's coming online now called an international tax on airlines. It's a tax that is being levied by 6 nation states right now. It's a progressive tax, so if you fly business class, you have to pay $10. If you fly economy, you have to pay $1. And that tax is feeding the Global Fund for AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. If you had an independent money stream for the WHO, the World Health Organization, if you had an independent money stream for UNICEF, which is also developing these kinds of independent money streams, you would have much more of a link between the publics that exist out there and the intergovernmental organizations or the global governance organizations, and that would raise the profile and allow the public to ask questions about decisions that are being taken there. I think that another way in which global civil society could be more powerful is if you consolidated single-issue activists into greater alliances that are focused on governance arrangements. This is also starting to happen where human rights, tobacco treaty, women's organizations are starting to come together to determine what would be necessary to have human rights treated on par with economic arrangements. So arrangements made in the WTO on par with arrangements taken through the UN. How could you make that happen? How could they be equally weighted in a system of governance? I don't think that global civil society is going to win the social, develop the social contracts that are necessary at the global level unless you have these kinds of alliances across single-issue silos. A fourth way is by demanding the extension of representative democracy into global institutions. What would it take to have some of our members who represent us every day in the Congress be active in global decision-making? Now, I said somebody just grimaced. Maybe you don't want that. But it would be interesting to think about what it would mean to have members of parliament engaged. There's a very active group in the United States called the Forum on Democracy and Trade, which is trying to bring governors into the equation of how trade debates get settled and trade decisions are made, in large part because it's the governors and the state legislators that are losing power every day to the decision-making arena. Right now, we have an executive branch, basically, that's operating in the global governance arena with absolutely no kind of parliamentary process surrounding it. So I think that would help. I always call it a global bureaucracy that's run amok. And then the last way that I want to mention is by creating an explicit global polity. One official of the World Bank said that the first necessary step to global democracy is the creation of a global polity. I want to talk a little bit about the World Social Forum, which is the only global political space available at the moment where the parameters are not set by states or corporations. It's the only one. You don't want to look too closely at it because, like all polities, it's very diverse. Some of the characters are not very pretty. But it's far more representative of the global population than any of the international NGOs that are out there, and from it emerges very important civic activism. Others feel the need to launch their campaigns that they want to create there. For example, the One campaign, which some people might be involved in, or the GGAP campaign, or the Water for Life campaign. And most importantly, nobody owns that space. You can do whatever you want with that space. And I think that's a really important aspect of creating a global polity. Okay, so where are we today? We have two major trends. One that pushes market models to resolving global social problems, and another that's setting a security paradigm in place which makes it much harder for civic forces to engage in global problems. The first one does not address the governance equation, and the second is embedded in nationalism and fear. Beginning with the latter point, since the 9/11 terrorist attacks in the United States, nationalism has been on the rise. Global civic organizations are increasingly being asked to declare their national interests, and those that remain committed to global concepts like human rights, peace or poverty alleviation are really becoming very close to being branded as enemies of the state. Citizen diplomacy has become much more difficult under the emerging security paradigm. I'll just give you one example of this. The U.S. government changed many of its policies and laws after 9/11 to require that any group like World Vision or CARE or Oxfam that's providing emergency relief anywhere, with any portion of that emergency relief coming from the U.S. government, to mark every single bit of the emergency relief as coming from the U.S. people. So it all has to have the USAID stamp on it now. And what this does is it demands, it blurs the line between state and private efforts to distribute emergency relief. It's placed aid workers at very great peril. More have died in 2006 than the 10 years previously combined. And it assumes that all aid is state-based. It assumes that the citizenry has no independent identity other than a state identity. And the U.S. is not alone in looking at these kinds of, or in enacting these kinds of provisions. The U.K. is also enacting similar types of provisions. And even countries like Holland, which have quite a benign international reputation, are asking their their co-financing agencies to be agents of the state. So the focus on terrorism and the new security paradigm is also driving a crackdown on civil society. The International Center for Not-for-Profit Law recently did a study that showed that 70 countries have new laws governing civil society that violate 3 basic rights: assembly, expression, and association. Examples can come from everywhere. They can come from here in the United States. They come from Azerbaijan and Georgia. They come from Uganda, which has got a reputation as being very friendly. India is got a repressive law on the books all of a sudden, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The regulatory environment for NGOs in many, many countries is now premised on the idea that NGOs are a front for terrorist organizations, and specific subsectors like Islamic NGOs suffer in particular from a loss of innocence, or the presumption of innocence. And it also impacts donors like Ford. Donors have to prove that they are not a conduit for funding violence when supporting NGOs. The rise of nationalism, hard state power, and the security paradigm really has not done very much to make us safer, in my view. We live in the most powerful state in the world, and it's not been able to protect its citizens, corporate or individual, from an organized, uncivil civic force like Al-Qaeda, or to protect citizens from the weather, or from avian flu, or SARS, or Ebola. You name them, you know them. We've lost the capacity to distribute the benefits of growth in an equitable manner and to manage market forces at the national level. And if we are increasingly looking inward and are only able to operate as agents of the state, we're not going to find solutions to these types of problems. In spite of the security paradigm, ordinary people are giving to NGOs at rates never before imagined to help address many of the global systemic problems. So there is a lot of will amongst the people. Josh had asked me if I would address some of this new money and some of the new donors and talk about what is their influence on these issues. So one of the solutions, which is very popular with the new philanthropists, are public-private partnerships. These define the way that Gates and Turner approach these global social problems. And these kinds of approaches have brought different resources to bear on usually on a singular focused problem like potable water, for example. A straightforward market model often places water out of the reach of the poor. Governments have failed in many parts of the world to distribute water, so how do you resolve that? Well, in a Turner model or in a Gates model, what you would do is you'd bring an NGO that has reach to the poor, a private company with a distribution chain, and a government with territorial rights to the resource together. And the government would cede its rights to the resource. The NGO would often define the technology and a way in which to meet the needs of the poor, and the private sector would deliver the goods. And that model has worked in some cases, in some issues, and in some places, but that model poses a governance challenge. Namely, how are the partners held to account within that partnership, and what is the accountability to the beneficiaries? We don't know the answer to those questions. And it defies what's called a rights-based framework, namely that some people believe that access to water is a right and it's not a commodity and it shouldn't be treated as a privilege or as a commodity. Public-private partnerships and the entrance of new donors has also forced rethinking and development, and it sparked some positive changes, like where public-private partnerships have worked to deliver the goods at the end of the day, or something called the bundling effect, where if you have a poor person who's traveling miles to a clinic to get a vaccine, why not give them all the vaccines they need there? Why not distribute condoms there? Why not have the school registration sitting there? So this is another type of impact that the new donors have had in thinking about how do we bundle the services and resources that people need in one area so that you have comprehensive service and comprehensive treatment. If the only thing that those new forces do is to help us rethink some of the ways in which we attack global social problems, that will be very useful, and it may further solutions that we haven't dreamed up yet. Nobody owns these problems. It's not something that you should be territorial about, so it's nice to see new voices and new money coming into the framework. However, there are some issues that cannot be addressed through the entrepreneurial spirit of new donors. Human rights violations defy market models, and they require hard slogging, or the hard slog of working through culture and power and governance arrangements. I think that we need patient capital that is focused on the underpinnings of human society to create sustainable change and address some of our most pressing needs. I believe we need democracy, which means we need to support myriad messengers, have the public involved, make sure that the solutions we bring are sustainable, and have the public be able to decide the priorities. Is it going to be AIDS or polio? Which one? It's been Ford's approach for many years to promote democracy beyond national borders and to try and strengthen global civic voices. We believe that this is a potential solution in a sustainable way to address many of the global challenges we face, and we need a global civic voice to help shape our collective future. So that's the donor perspective that I will bring to you. Sure.
Thanks very much. I'd like to, I guess, if you want to field your own questions, that would be
Okay, that's fine. Can I have your pen?
Oh, yeah.
Thanks. Go ahead.
Going back to the part where you said that there are places where civil society has a role at the table where they're both part of the process and they have votes. Could you give an example, and like how do those people get chosen?
Exactly.
Who decides who represents the rest of society for whatever those people are doing?
Yep. Okay, should I take a bunch of questions, or is that the only question? Go ahead.
Do you think that this move for increasing accountability and transparency in civil society translates at all into government work? Is that part of the purpose? And how can there be any linkages between?
Okay. Go ahead.
When you talk about increasing democracy, this builds up to the other question. I'm a little concerned that people are going to be more locally focused, and that if you put it to a vote, Americans are going to vote to diminish resource provisions to the underserved populations in Africa, because there's competing demands, and I feel like people are thinking locally much more than globally. So I'm concerned that when you say we want to increase democracy in a global movement, that we're presuming that democracy is going to have the interest of the global society as a priority.
Okay, it's a good challenge. Was there a question in the back? Okay, I'll start with these. Okay, the question about how are those NGOs chosen? And they are NGOs. They're not social movement representatives who have a seat at the table and get to vote on behalf of global citizens. In fact, they're generally chosen by a smaller subset of organizations, civic organizations, CSOs, civil society organizations, and international NGOs who have been part of the negotiating process within the global political space for quite some time. And that is, the question is exactly the problem. Who are they accountable to? How did they get there? Who are they representing? That's very difficult to answer, very difficult to answer. And so until we have good answers to that question, and until we have a really good process for determining who should get to sit at the table for civil society, I think you have an issue. And perhaps that's not the right role for people to be playing. It confuses civic and political space, or civic and political, state and civic responsibilities profoundly. So that's why I have a concern about how you get to the table, or who gets to the table. The question about does the call for accountability within civil society translate into accountability needed in governance organizations? Is that correct?
Well, if increased accountability within non-governmental organizations can impact better governance of states, or if there is a link there at all.
Right. Okay, so in Latin America, there is a link. And in emerging democracies like in Indonesia, I think there is a link. Where democratic practice has not been the practice du jour, has not been the practice of a state. Oftentimes, if civil society figures out how to be more democratic, more inclusive, more accountable, you can show a model to the state agent that you're trying to influence. So I think that there is potentially a link at the local level or at the national level, especially in countries where democracy is trying to emerge. I also think that there is a possibility that better models of accountability in global civil society might have the potential to help global governing institutions try and figure out how to be accountable to a public. But I don't think that across the board the calls for accountability or accountability within NGOs or within CSOs it will influence governance arrangements or will influence whether or not governments are more accountable. I don't think that's true across the board. I think it's true in some particular, at particular times and particular contexts. And the reason I don't think it's true across the board is because civic organizations, even if they are accountable by if they're accountable to their donors, for example, which they often are, or they're accountable to the state, that does not necessarily mean they have an accountability mechanism to the public. So talking about civic accountability does not necessarily translate into an accountability to public, especially to beneficiaries. And so it's a topic that needs to be unpacked much more, and it's in fact one of the reasons why we thought it was important to put a whole bunch of models about how NGOs are dealing with accountability, at least that section of civil society, how they're dealing with accountability, because we wanted to make an argument, we meaning my co-author and I wanted to make an argument that you could not have a one-size-fits-all approach to the question of NGO accountability. So I think it can have some influence, but I don't think it is always going to have that kind of influence. If you had a more democratic global political arena, would that mean that you might diminish resources for poor people in developing countries because U.S. citizens are focused inward? Let's put it that way. I don't think that's true. Actually, I think if you look at the response from the tsunami all around the world, you saw an incredible outpouring of resources. If you look at Katrina, you saw an incredible outpouring of resources that organizations that the recipients of those resources never thought was possible. So I think that, and also Stephen Cull, who does polling around the world and polling of opinion leaders and so on and so forth, will belie the fact that this sort of conventional wisdom that U.S. citizens do not think it's important to be engaged in a constructive way with the world at large. So I would not necessarily think that was going to be, that would be potentially the outcome. You might get a much more contested arena. You might get a much more contested approach to public policy making, and I don't think necessarily that would be a bad thing. Those are the three questions, right? Please.
I agree that, looking at Katrina or tsunami, easy to see how many people donated money, but the more long-term issues, even with Katrina, we see that, attention doesn't, people don't just keep giving. So for, the longer-term issues, I feel like that would be a problem.
Is there another comment on this? I think on the economic issues, like on the trade issues, sometimes you can see people looking for a much more self-interested approach. But I don't necessarily think that's a problem, because what people are asking for is predominantly a much fairer arrangement, a fair trade arrangement, as opposed to the a winner-takes-all arrangement. And I think that people can be convinced that a fairer trade arrangement is also in their self-interest, their long-term self-interest, as opposed to a short-term self-interest. Another example, probably a better example, is around the U.S. efforts to stop to not have bilateral arrangements with countries that sign the International Criminal Court or ratify the International Criminal Court. Today, you have a strong presence of military folks who are supporting the ratification of the International Criminal Court, because in the long term, it's going to impact our soldiers, they think, in a much better way for that to be ratified than in a short-term way, which is how the administration has talked about it. So I think that if you have an open conversation, that people will choose perhaps to have a set of rules that everybody has to adhere to, as opposed to a set of rules that only some people have to adhere to, which is the way that much of the international negotiating space is being arranged today. And I think that because of the culture that we have in terms of a rule-based society, people would understand that argument. But we don't know. I mean, I'm speculating. I have no idea, because these are not public debates in the United States context at this point in time. So, are there other comments, or please?
I wanted to build on this accountability issue a little bit more without running into the ground. But the idea that civil society organizations, by taking on these responsibilities, can be weakening states, and by that I mean they can be taking on the roles and responsibilities of states and diminishing by assuming the responsibilities of the state, the states don't reform, and you may not have the positive growth of governance. Am I way off the mark?
Well, you juxtaposed a weak state with a strong civil society, and I don't think that's true. I don't think there's any evidence that if you have a strong civil society, you have a weak state. I think that states strengthen themselves when they have a strong civil society within that state. We have a fairly strong civil society. We don't have a terribly strong civil society in the United States. India has a very strong civic process. They have a strong state as well. I might get in trouble because I'm going to mention the Philippines, but the Philippines have a very strong civil society that is contesting the role of the state, and in the process strengthening the accountability of the state to the people. So I would not start with a premise of, if you have a strong civil society, you get a weak state at the end of the day. I think that's what a lot of authoritarian states are worried about, and I also do think that it depends upon how you discuss the strength of states. Is the strength of state the ability to repress the civic space, the ability to oppress the public sphere, or is the strength of the state the ability to be able to govern in governance arrangements that empower the voice of citizens? Which is it? In the global political arena, you don't have any of these democratic processes, and the introduction of NGOs sitting in these global governance arrangements doesn't necessarily bring you any closer to a democratic process. So that's another sort of set of issues that has to be uncoupled. Just because you have, let's say, people living with AIDS sitting in the body of making decisions around the Global Fund doesn't necessarily mean that you have a much more democratic process. I don't think that's true at this juncture, because People Living with AIDS is a membership-based organization that's responsive to its own members. It's not responsive to the global public at large. Go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry to go back to the first question, but you didn't provide an example. Can you give an example? I mean, if you can't say an organization's name, but just say there's one group who,
I just gave an example. People Living with AIDS is a membership-based organization that's an international NGO that has voting rights in the Global Fund for AIDS. It has voting rights. That's an example. Yeah. Gary.
Thank you, Lisa.
Gary is my old colleague from Ford.
I want to endorse the emphasis that you put on the really critical linkages between actors at the global level and those within individual nations. And that kind of alliance is really making a difference, I think. Then I'd like to push and see if you go a little bit further than that, because many of the NGOs that I work with at the national level, in fact, argued that what was most important for them was a regional alliance or a global South-South kind of alliance. They had much more to learn from their colleagues in the South than they did from those working at the international level. Or that they needed to work on the African Union, the new economic partnership for Africa as well, because there were venues there for citizen participation that were not available at the global level. And by learning from each other, they thought they could gain great traction in ways that they couldn't from those at the global level. So what would a donor have to do to try and support that kind of South-South co-effort?
Well, as you know, through the Global Civil Society program at the Ford Foundation, we do have many South-South alliances that we support. One of them is Shack Dwellers International. Another one's called GROOTS. There's a Rag Pickers Association. There's 6 of them that I support out of my portfolio, which are what I would call horizontal, right? Horizontal associations. And their targets of intervention, their advocacy targets can be national, local, so they can be the city mayors in Calcutta, for example, who are violating the rights of homeless people by bulldozing slum federations, or bulldozing ghetto slums, however they're discussed in different countries. And I think that those are really important ways in which to strengthen global civil societies to support those horizontal associations. But for me, what's important is to think about those horizontal associations and their interventions locally, nationally, regionally, globally. So the vertical political arenas that interact with each other on a day-to-day basis and whether or not how they impact the particular issues that the horizontal South-South networks are trying to counter. To me, there's a very important global governance arrangement that can impact not every issue, but many of the issues, like environmental issues or rights issues or housing issues in this particular instance. So I do think that that supporting those South-South arrangements or horizontal membership associations or horizontal civil society organizations that operate between states is very important. But you're not always going to be able to resolve the dilemma that you are trying to resolve in that particular space. So that's how I would answer the question. And I also think that Ford is actually not very well equipped as an institution to be able to address that because we don't have the regional approaches that are well resourced that we used to have. So I think that you would have to have a focus. You'd have to have a better resourced regional approach if you wanted to address that in its region. Jim?
Lisa, thank you for a very stimulating talk. I'd like to draw you out on an observation made through the beginning of your talk on the notion that civic society organizations in some sense are trying to claim the state of the table. And obviously for states, many of them are reluctant to have to cede a place at the table because it in some sense diminishes their ability to control events to the depth of degree of desire. And obviously one of the ways is you referred to putting regulations and rules on civic society organizations. I think it actually sort of most notably movements by the Russian government in recent years, particularly as is portrayed as Western penetration of Russia, thereby destroying the true Russian democracy. But there's also a different aspect. People like Sebastian now, as I'm sure you know, have argued that one of the sort of unintended consequences of having civic society organizations have a state international organizations is creating more red tape. To some extent, this has led certain potential lenders from groups like the World Bank to say it's not worth it. And indeed, in this role, the Chinese have often stepped in as a way of sort of allowing people to not to go to the World Bank, and there will be transparency, oversight, community involvement. Go back to the old one. I want people to comment on what is it, real problems, how sort of civil society organizations can respond.
Right. So the argument of if we don't fund it, China will. And you have no voice when the Chinese are the primary funder, and you get a small voice when we're the funders. So you better stick with the devil you know versus the devil you don't know. Very familiar argument. I tried to get Sebastian to argue this publicly with my boss, and he refused. So it's the counterfactual argument, and it's an argument that the World Bank has been using for quite some time, that Sebastian Maley picked up for them. I use the Chad-Cameroon pipeline as the factual, not as the counterfactual. In the Chad-Cameroon pipeline, civil society, this is a pipeline that goes from oil fields in Chad that had not been developed for fat oil, so not thin oil, meaning that it has to be refined a great deal before it's usable, through Cameroon, all the way through the state of the Cameroon to the coast. It had social impacts, it had environmental impacts. It is alleged by the U.S. State Department that in order to make the area where the oil fields were developed ready for development, 250 people were massacred. So it has human rights violations attached to it. It's got indigenous communities in Cameroon that have been negatively impacted. It's got primary forests that have been negatively impacted. And the breadbasket of Chad is right in the area where the pipeline was going to take place. So there was a lot of potential impacts. And the organizations in Chad argued that this would not be a successful investment for the country without the democracy framework that was necessary to make sure that the resources generated by this pipeline for the country of Chad could be used by the public to address social services. And that was an argument that civil society brought to the bank over the course of 3 years in arguing why the bank should not be engaged in the Chad-Cameroon pipeline. The bank remained engaged. The investors changed. Different investors came to the table, in part because civil society made it so expensive to actually develop these oil fields. So all the arguments that Malaby makes about participation making it expensive are true. And at the end of the day, the pipeline went through. So the project was financed, and the World Bank had put all sorts of mechanisms in attachment to its loans to make sure that the resources would be used for social services and for the development of the needs of the poor, essentially. At the end of the day, the resources were not used for the poor. That's documented. We know it for a fact. And so for Sebastian Malaby to say, well, if we don't do it, China's going to do it, or for the bank to say, if we don't do it, China's going to do it, and we can do it better, is in fact not true. Regardless, the infrastructure project had a negative impact on the people. Chad's military budget went up. France gave it $700 million worth of military equipment straight off the board the day the loan was signed. It was absolutely incredible. So to me, the way to argue the counterfactual is to look at what really happens. And those people's lives have not been improved by that particular infrastructure investment at the end of the day. And it's the perfect foil for the Malaby argument, I think. It's a perfect foil.
The sort of civil society sectors come out of, I guess, a progressive tradition, but there are other actors out there, like the NRA, active on small arms, and so I'm wondering to what extent, that there's competition in that space for other actors to complicate the scene, and what you see there. The second question is sort of different. There's sort of a presumption that the NGO community knows best because they have a closer connection to the grassroots, whoever they may be. But I feel like in terms of problem diagnosis, NGOs often are good at raising issues, but I'm not sure if anybody has an adequate grasp of what the appropriate policy instruments are. So you end up sort of trapped in the process with the Kyoto Protocol, where the NGO sector has been demanding binding emissions cuts short term, but that has made politicians, in order to be perceived as green, sort of pay lip service, and you get 10 years of inaction. whereas I think a different policy approach probably would have been more proactive, but because the NGOs are seen as having sort of a monopoly on their issue space and defining the terms for what it means to do appropriate action in that, whatever that issue area is, we give them a free pass. And so I like to push back a little bit on whether or not, you know, the NGOs have the best answer for a lot of the problems in the global public arena.
Okay. The definition of who in civil society the Ford Foundation supports is a progressive definition. The definition of who constitutes global civil society, I would argue, is not a progressive definition. It's not. To me, global civil society incorporates all of those organizations like the NRA and the International Sportsmen Association, which is its sort of its global creation, if you will, that just defeated the gun control measure in Brazil. This is an important part of global civil society and needs to be I think needs to be understood, because if you're only looking at the progressive side, then you can say it's all happiness and, oh, these people are wonderful, they're fighting for social change or social justice, and that's not always the case. There is another side of global civil society that does not share that does not share the same set of values. Let's put it that way. So I want to contest the definition of civil society as being always progressive. Now, let's take that example of the climate change. NGOs like World Wildlife Fund, the National Resources Defense Council, IUCN, are all involved in the climate change negotiation, and they all bring different types of things to the table. But the pool of competitive policy ideas was really formulated by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which was a body of 1,900 scientists that did not agree on the best possible policy approach, and helped the governments and helped the NGOs understand what were the consequences of the various policy options that were put to the table. The NGOs in that space, what they brought to the table was a voice. They did not bring a vote to the table. So it is a normal policy negotiation process that takes place with some civic voices involved, civic voices, not civic votes. And ultimately, it was the governments that decided what should go into the protocol and what shouldn't go into the protocol. This is a very normal political process. It's the political process that we use here. It's used in India. It's used everywhere where you have elements of democracy. And I don't see any reason why you would not want to extend that to a global public policy process. I don't think that there is a problem with having strong, single-focused voices, public interest groups, if you will, involved in having a voice to try and persuade governments to take the right choice. So I don't see that as a problem. And if some are more powerful than others, or some are working in coalition and that makes them more powerful than others, that's how politics works. That's what it does. And we can't forget, I didn't talk at all about the fact that the corporate sector is heavily involved in these international negotiations. And they have hard power. They have the power of money to persuade the institutions, the governing institutions, to move in one direction or another. So it's not as if there isn't a counter force involved in any public policy negotiation. In the look at the WIPO, the Intellectual Property Organization. Its entire budget is paid by membership fees, which are corporate membership fees. You have to have $25,000 to play. World Economic Forum, another one. So there are countervailing forces and countervailing powers within the public policy domains, and I don't believe that that the NGOs have a particular power that isn't countered by other types of power. Is that it? Any other?
Maybe one more question for
Yeah.
What is it, maybe expand a little bit more on the sort of donor horizon with new entrants like Gates, what you think that means for existing long-time foundations like the Ford Foundation. How do you see their role impacting what you do?
I don't know that I really don't know that Gates is going to have a profound impact on the way in which the Ford Foundation operates, because the Ford Foundation is a large foundation. Gates may have, and we operate on different levels. So it's the patient capital versus the entrepreneurial approach to some degree, though people would contest that because they would say that, for example, public-related investments are business approaches that the Ford Foundation has been championing for 20 years, and that's a very entrepreneurial approach. But I don't, in particular, I don't see that that the Gates and Turner and other types of new money that's coming into philanthropy is going to profoundly change the way in which MacArthur, Ford, Rockefeller, maybe, we'll see how they come out the other end, but how these bigger US-based foundations operate. I can imagine that if you are a family foundation, you have $6 million that you're granting in a year, and Gates enters the field within which you are involved, that may change your approach to what you're doing in that field, because the volume of resources that just entered your field completely changes how much leverage you have, how many actors are involved in the field, so on and so forth. So one of the big differences between Gates and Turner and some of the new money and old money, if you will, is that the way in which foundations traditionally have operated is to set up pilot projects and pilot approaches to things and hope that governments will take them to the next level. With the amount of resources that Gates must, by law, give away every year, you may be moving away from pilot approaches and trying to convince others to take them up and into, we can resolve the problem by ourselves. And then I think that leads to a governance challenge. How do you, is it sustainable, and how are people responsive to the beneficiaries that they're trying to serve at the end of the day?
I remember there was a instance in which Bechtel offered to run Congo back in the day. I wonder if I don't know if Congo would be any better off for it, but you can imagine this sort of Gates brand as being like the global health providers that serves both the power of the World Health Organization, but also of national governments and their health services. And maybe that's just sort of a long way challenge that we might have to perceive. But I don't know if you, in your sort of landscape position, if you see how they're already playing a role along those lines.
It's, you know, most of the things that I do are focused on global public policy making and bringing citizen voices into that arena. And that's not an arena at the governance equation level that Gates has been involved in. In specific aspects of that arena, he's been, the foundation has been heavily involved, like in the polio vaccine or in the in health issues. And so I think A, it's too soon to say what that impact might look like. B, there's a lot of conversation going on between foundations. So Gates just hired 3 people to run a governance program. And the first thing they did was called Ford Foundation. What are you guys doing on this field? How does it look to you? Blah, blah, blah. So there's a lot of conversation going on. But I really can't say where it's going to end up. I think that the whole issue of public-private partnerships, again, has an accountability equation in it that needs to be unpacked and looked at to determine what does that mean if Gates's resources are much more than the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And he wants to be involved in there. Who knows? I don't know.
Well, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank you for coming down.
Thank you.